Our next presentation this afternoon concerns teaching critical empathy in a post-truth, pro-feelings age. Molly Worthen is Assistant Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on North American religious and intellectual history, particularly the ideas and culture of conservative Christianity. Her most recent book, Apostles of Reason, The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism, published by Oxford University Press, examines American evangelical intellectual life since 1945. Professor Worthen is also a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. She has written about religion and politics for the New Yorker, Slate, The American Prospect, Foreign Policy, and other publications. Please help me welcome Molly Worthen.
Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's been remarkable sitting through last night and today, to me anyway, to note how these papers are all talking to one another. I mean, those of you who don't attend academic conferences very often, you might assume that that is always the case, and it is not at all. It's really, maybe there was some like secret Facebook group where you were all sharing your papers that I wasn't a part of, but it's really been intellectually fruitful and really helpful for me, because I am going to talk today about some ideas that up to this point I've really spoken and written about only in a pretty fragmentary form, and my own ideas are very much in a rough draft phase. So hearing your reflections has been helpful to me. I want to talk about empathy, which is the ability to understand, or at least try to understand, how it might feel to be in someone's position, inhabiting their worldview and their circumstances. This is a pretty controversial idea. It's controversial among psychologists, social scientists, other scholars. It's controversial among many activists, especially on the left. Last year, the Yale psychology professor Paul Bloom published a book called Against Empathy, in which he argued that this effort to try to experience another human being's situation is inevitably misleading, biased, it is overly tainted with emotion, and generally, he says, it is a very bad guide for making moral decisions in the world. What we really should seek, he says, is a more detached, kind of utilitarian approach that he calls rational compassion. Now, that book did not come out of nowhere. Over the past few decades, progressive scholars and activists have mounted a kind of intermittent but sustained attack on empathy as really a kind of condescending lie, especially when it is exercised by white, straight men. A lie in which the empathizer simply imposes their own assumptions on the subject and pretends those are the subject's feelings, and then awards themselves a kind of moral superiority. Last year, a philosophy professor at Texas State University named Keisha Ray published an essay called Intersectionality and the Dangers of White Empathy When Treating Black Patients, in which she worried that the vogue for empathy training in medical schools encourages, and here are her words, exaggeration of differences between racial groups and overgeneralization of members within a racial group, mainly because, she says, people are unwilling to accept their role in racist institutions and unwilling to confront their own racist behaviors. Now, in the world of arts and letters, it has become very controversial for a white writer or screenwriter or artist to create a character whose visible genetic phenotype differs from their own. Last year, the Canada Council for the Arts issued a statement announcing that it would interrogate all funding proposals for any sign of cultural appropriation. And they are especially on the lookout for any proposal, request for funding for a project that claims to convey something about indigenous people's experiences if it seems to come from what the council called a colonialist perspective. When an editor at the editor at The Walrus, which is one of the major magazines in Canada, it's kind of the Canadian equivalent of The New Yorker. It's not quite as good as The New Yorker, but it's a serious magazine. This is a journalist named Jonathan Kay, when he wrote an op-ed, not boldly defending cultural appropriation, but simply suggesting in a pretty calm, even-handed manner that artists and writers should debate this problem seriously, because maybe appropriation of a worldview other than your own is actually the heart of what makes artistic work possible. When he just put this out there as something that we need to actually wrestle with, he was hounded into resigning. The upshot of these critiques, I think, is that it is not a good idea to strive for empathy, because the human imagination always falls short, and it falls short in damaging ways. And there is no such thing as meaningful common humanity or human experience. And any efforts that we might want to make towards self-transcendence really should take the form of self-criticism, reflecting, critiquing our own experiences, and silently listening to other people. Now, in my own classes, I would say many of my students really inspire me with their open minds and their really broad curiosity, but there are some students who are picking up on this warning from the left. They regularly deploy terms that I'm not sure they totally understand themselves, terms like intersectionality and cultural appropriation, and they are learning to be extremely cynical about the possibility for mutual understanding. Now, on the other hand, since the 2016 election, I've heard a lot of criticisms of the mainstream liberal media for failing to understand the millions of people who voted for Donald Trump, and failing even to be interested in making the effort. It seems like at many of the panels that I've attended on politics in the past 18 months, if the subject of Trump comes up, at some point in the Q&A, someone will stand up, and they will usually be quick to say that they themselves are liberal, but they will accuse whoever is on the panel of condescension toward the Trump voter, of making it all a what's the matter with Kansas problem, and refusing to take the task of empathy seriously. My own view is that, first, of course, perfect empathy is impossible. But second, it seems to me that civilization will fall apart if we don't strive for it. I guess this makes me something like an empathy pragmatist. Pragmatists like Charles Peirce and William James believed that perfect truth is unattainable, but they were not nihilistic relativists, and this is something I always struggle to get my students to understand about the pragmatists. Truth for them was an asymptote. So over time, with scientific progress, humans could hope to get closer and closer, even if they could never hope to perfectly, reach it. And the pragmatists thought that we can only make progress if we are aware of our own foundational assumptions, we are conscious of our emotional attachments to communities, to prejudices, and we hold these things both lightly and dearly at the same time. That is, with a combination of commitment and self-criticism. And it's all a very imperfect process, I think they recognize, but at least it can be, more often than not, a self-aware one. This view that I've just articulated, I think it is definitely on the retreat, both in academia and in our wider political culture. And I want to turn now to two different intellectual habits, one on the left and one on the right, that I worry are turning students and Americans generally into empathy skeptics. Humans generally like to believe that we are privy to occult secrets. We love to think that we have gone through some kind of initiation that allows us to see what is really going on while everyone else is walking around with bags over their heads. And when a book or a teacher introduces us to a hidden truth, it's kind of like the ancient Gnostics who taught their followers that you've got to flip the conventional teachings of Christianity on their head in order to have true access to the divine. And when you're told this, it's immensely flattering and exciting. It makes you feel like you're in the know. I want to focus on the cultural influence of two Gnostic high priests on either side of the aisle On the left, the French philosopher Michel Foucault, and on the right, the evangelical culture warrior Francis Schaeffer. I'm not going to try to get into the nuances of either thinker or their traditions. For our purposes, I'm really much more interested in the vague, oversimplified, usually partly wrong ways their ideas are understood by the vast majority of people, which is to say, people who have typically not read any of their work, may not be able to spell their names, may not even be remotely aware of their influence. Yet they have picked up catchphrases and ideas and a kind of posture from the culture around them. And I'll start with the legacy of Foucault. Now, of course, Foucault, what I'm about to talk about, it's not a set of ideas that spring perfectly, fully formed from the forehead of Foucault. I mean, his writings on social control and institutions are all have to be understood as part of a tradition, a particular moment in intellectual history, the history of the New Left. Much of what Eric alluded to in his talk, this moment when many thinkers were wrestling with the question of what happened to the revolution that was supposed to show up? What happened to the working class? Why is totalitarianism so much more insidious? Why is capitalism so much more robust than we counted on? But I'm going to kind of set that complicated story aside for our purposes. It seems to me that a lot of people on the left, students, activists, many academics, have taken from Foucault a simple and profound observation that everything is about power. Not just that, but people who have power spend a lot of time trying to make their power so ubiquitous that it becomes totally embedded in life. It is everywhere, yet it is almost invisible. And this assumption then becomes the master lens for understanding politics, art, history, economics, everything. All human life becomes like one of those 3D images that were popular when I was in junior high and high school, where if you stare at the random dots for long enough, you start to see a shape, and that shape is power. In academic work in particular, and I see students and professors operating on this assumption, this means that the main point of what we are doing in the classroom ought to be exposing these hidden power dynamics and announcing their injustice. Here is how Foucault put it in one of his lectures that were collected in the volume Society Must Be Defended. He was talking in this context about the discipline of history in particular, but I think what he says goes for his view of all academic study. He said that the moral thing for scholars to do is to engage in their study and teaching as a protest, a critique, and an oppositional discourse. On the eve of Trump's inauguration, the anthropologist Paul Stoller published an essay in Huffington Post calling for scholars to resist Trump by getting together and reading Foucault. And I think he was taking a page from Foucault and suggesting that. I see this basic posture as the default position of many of my more lefty students, and they're not in the majority. I want to stress that. However, my sense of the dynamics in my own classroom is that often these students have disproportionate power over the conversations we have. The other students have this instinct to treat them as kind of ideological crossing guards, and they will respond to the rules that these students set. Now, I doubt that these students, in most cases, have read any Foucault. Only the most advanced of them could invoke him in an explicit way. But in my courses on North American religious history, intellectual history, I see that these students are not primarily interested in understanding the arguments of the text itself, except insofar as they have to pass the exam. The questions at the front of their minds are, whom does this text exclude and somehow oppress? And what are my duties to those people? That's what they really care about. I want to note, though, one question that does not seem to come up very often, and that is, how might true freedom be possible? Foucault seemed to have total contempt for anyone who thought it was actually possible, even for the most woke among us, to actually escape the iron cage of modernity. Even the scholar and the social critic is, as he put it, a cog in the panoptic machine, invested by its effects of power, which we bring to ourselves, since we are part of its mechanisms. Here is what the Marxist philosopher Marshall Berman wrote about the strange appeal of this sense of helplessness, sometimes a bit of complicity, sometimes victimhood, in his book, All That Is Solid Melts into Air. He says, Foucault offers a generation of refugees from the 1960s a world historical alibi for the sense of passivity and helplessness that gripped so many of us in the 1970s. There is no point in trying to resist the oppressions and injustices of modern life, since even our dreams of freedom only add more links to our chains. However, once we grasp the total futility of it all, at least we can relax. There are a number of problems, I think, with this worldview. And the first one I want to mention, I think, builds on one of the points that Mark was making last night. I think that this attitude prevents its disciples from wanting to learn how to gain and manage power in a serious, humane, and real-world way. At the most kind of basic, concrete level, I think it encourages students to take classes only in subaltern studies, to the exclusion of courses in, say, the history of statecraft or the history of the American presidency, which they perceive, without any regard to how that course might actually be taught, as conservative, as sort of on the bad side of what they're up to in their education. And I think this is a total shame. I have a colleague who teaches a course on the history of human rights at the same time, usually during the same semester, that he teaches a course on the history of war and peace since Napoleon, so a very traditional diplomatic history course. And the enrollment patterns are so interesting. Year after year, the human rights course attracts mostly women, mostly sort of idealistic lefties, who are always a little bit confused to find that the syllabus is full of dead white men like John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx. And on the other hand, the course on military and diplomatic history always enrolls, you can probably guess, mostly men who are either politically somewhat indifferent or conservatives. This has happened year after year. And every year my colleague wishes that he could mingle the two rosters. You know, in both cases, students would stand to benefit, but he especially wishes that his students who are interested in the history of human rights had some idea of how states have historically exercised power in geopolitics. Avoiding the history of power as it has actually been practiced for most of history in the West from the vantage point of those who have exercised it, because that story happens to be an account of mostly white men, does these students an enormous disservice. It shrinks the questions they learn to ask and the ambitions that they cultivate. I think it's very hard to translate an admirable desire that so many of them have to address the sources of social and economic inequality if they haven't studied some old-fashioned political history. The second problem is that this fixation on exposing power becomes, in classroom conversations and in scholarly projects, an anti-intellectual, anti-humanist hammer that has a way of flattening multiple complicated dimensions of human life. And it also, I mean, it not only flattens the subject, I think, but it can kind of create a wall between the subject and the student by suggesting that to try to understand the subject's worldview is to somehow endorse a power grab, to be complicit in an act of imperialist subjugation. Third, this posture assumes that the main point of intellectual inquiry is critique, deconstruction, not discovery or understanding or positive creation. Now, of course, at some level, one man's deconstruction is another man's discovery, but I really think that the difference in attitude, the difference in our narratives about what we're doing in academia, what its ultimate purpose is quite fundamental. Now, when social commentators try to tell the story of how American political culture got to where it is today, with so many Americans dismissing mainstream media as fake news and preferring the pseudo-reality of the former reality TV star in the White House, they frequently gesture toward the bogey of postmodernism. And the more elaborate versions of this pop diagnosis sometimes invoke Foucault, although as far as I know, he himself rejected that label. Now, of course, to some degree, it's correct to link Foucault with a certain skepticism toward truth claims, because for him, knowledge is power in disguise. So, okay, the idea of our postmodern political moment, this is a cliche at this point, and like most cliches, it has some truth in it. But I think, really, this fake news phenomenon has much longer roots on the right, roots that anticipated and exacerbated the left-leaning, postmodern suspicion of empiricist truth claims. And these roots run so deep and are so kind of firm in certain American subcultures because they are really centuries old. To get into this, I want to talk about the evangelist Francis Schaeffer, who had a roughly 20-year speaking and publishing and filmmaking career before he died in 1984, the very same year as Foucault, by interesting coincidence. And I want to be very clear that as a thinker, Schaeffer does not approach the same plane of originality and sophistication that Foucault occupies. And I'm really using him here as a representative of a much broader and complex tradition. Schaeffer was a right-wing Gnostic high priest who became the greatest popularizer of a set of ideas that have had really profound effects on conservative Christian America and have kind of seeped into conservatism more generally. And their effects are really not all that unlike the cultural influence of Foucault on the left. So this is a kind of counterintuitive comparison, but I think there's something here. Let me zoom out a little bit. So much of Donald Trump's appeal does not start with ideological reasoning. It starts with the alternative reality that he creates and his ability to steamroll over unwelcome information. White American evangelicals have a long tradition of defending the Bible against the incursions of modern scholars and dismissing secular experts. And this is a tradition that goes back at least to how theologians responding to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries came up with a highly rationalistic, pseudo-scientific way of talking about Scripture's authority that really tried to answer science on its own terms and refute secular experts. A bit later, when conservatives responded to the higher biblical criticism coming out of the German universities at that time in the late 19th century, they argued that these debates over the historical truth of, say, the accounts of the miracles in the Gospels, this sort of thing, that these were not just fights over the claims of discrete Bible verses, but really they were trying to fend off an attack on God's authority. And they were worried about a scholarly project fundamentally based on atheistic assumptions. So there is a tradition here of being skeptical of the assumptions motivating secular experts. That's my point. At the same time, I would say most Christians in America through the late 19th century, certainly most evangelicals, still thought that evangelism called them to argue rationally with non-Christians. So they were very into natural theology, that is, using evidence out in the world, physical evidence that non-believers have access to in order to argue for the existence of God. Then there's an interesting turn around the turn of the 20th century. The Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper, and I'm always hesitant to invoke Kuyper in Dutch Reformed territory. I want to be clear, I'm not going to do justice to Kuyper and these couple of remarks that follow. Kuyper laid the groundwork for a new way of thinking about the way Christians argue with non-Christians. So broadly, we are still on this question of empathy, insofar as I'm talking about how you talk to and understand people different from yourself. Kuyper moved away from natural theology, from trying so hard to prove Christianity with evidence, empirical evidence available to us all. And he focused instead on the presuppositions, the foundational assumptions that distinguish Christianity from a materialist worldview. This way of thinking really came into full bloom at Westminster Theological Seminary outside of Philadelphia in a school of thought known as presuppositionalism, taught particularly by one professor there, a Dutch Reformed theologian named Cornelius van Til, who was active from the 30s through the 60s and taught a number of young evangelicals who then went on to be quite influential thought leaders. Van Til thought that it was hopeless for Christians to try to persuade non-Christians through reasoned argument, because one can only accurately understand evidence out in the world if you are proceeding from the right assumptions, mainly the assumption of the truth of the inerrant Bible. So this gives you a handy way to dismiss the arguments or information that you don't like. You can simply say that your opponent's presumptions are wrong, and voila, you can deem it fake news. Francis Schaeffer was one of Van Til's most prominent students. I spent a lot of time in my last book tracing the influence of this way of thinking on some of the leading evangelical evangelists and public intellectual types, people like Schaeffer. Schaeffer became a kind of wandering cultural prophet among American evangelicals from the 60s into the 1980s. He sold a ton of books. He made a couple of epic Kenneth Clark-style documentaries about the decline of the West. And he played a big role in mobilizing the evangelical pro-life movement, among other things. Schaeffer and folks like him brilliantly used presuppositionalism, packaged in the language of the Christian worldview versus the secular humanist worldview. Understand that your worldview is different from your opponent's, to give evangelicals a way to talk back to secular scholarship, to secular politicians, and feel they had emerged victorious, more savvy. And I think when Trump began speaking this way, he capitalized on a long history of evangelical intellectual practice. They are old hands at rejecting difficult facts as fake news. Now, at most secular universities, certainly my own, this perspective, the Schaefferian presuppositionalist perspective, it's not usually all that visible in the classroom, but it does show up, and certainly in North Carolina, it is the view that increasingly dominates the right side of our state politics and leads many conservatives to take a basically hostile posture toward the purveyors of fake news that they see operating in ivory towers of academia. If you follow the logic of this tradition that I've just summarized, then the idea is that if you expose the presuppositions of the secular experts, you discover the hidden agenda of atheism. You discover an effort to advance a militantly anti-Christian vision under the guise of supposedly neutral policing of the public square and intellectual discourse. So, a truth claim is a kind of power grab. It is a power grab aimed at persecuted, marginalized, subaltern conservative Christianity. So from a certain angle, you see a kind of second-rate Foucauldianism here. And as with the parallel syndrome on the left, conservatives who take this view find that it gives them the empowering feeling of scales falling from their eyes, and suddenly they see the world as it really is. There are a couple more common patterns to notice here, I think. One is, and this is really important, that at the core of each of these two Gnosticisms is a basically correct and important insight. Yes, humans seek power. Yes, we build our quest for power into many of the things we do and the stories we tell. And yes, of course, everyone has a set of foundational assumptions, and we may only be dimly aware of them, yet they frame our reasoning and our reactions to the world. And recognizing these things are important. They're as important for interpreting a text in the classroom as they are for making sense of your Facebook feed during a political campaign. Yet it seems to me that both of these mental habits have kind of run amok, and as a result, they've become the very opposite of the critical thinking skills that our students are supposed to be learning in the classroom, because they encourage students to pass new evidence through a kind of formula and arrive at a basically predetermined conclusion, rather than reasoning for themselves. Both habits of thought also erode any sense of common human experience or mutually accessible reality, which are key prerequisites for any attempt at that pragmatist critical empathy I mentioned earlier. Both urge on that human tendency toward self-flattery and a really crippled sense of solidarity, the identity politics we've been talking about this whole conference that have become so dominant on both sides of the spectrum. So, what can scholars and teachers do to respond to this? A few minutes ago, I criticized Foucault and his errors for reducing the point of education to criticism and deconstruction. And so I can't do that and then not just give you only criticism in my own little talk. So I've got 3 ideas, which are all very, very general and preliminary, and I hope maybe some more will come out of our conversation. First, we need to teach our students, I think more explicitly than we do now, the difference between bias and argument. I don't know about those of you who teach, but my own students just love to point out the bias of the authors we read. They often think that identifying the hidden, unfair prejudices is the main point of reading. And once you do that, you are done. Because whatever the prejudices are, well, they must totally render moot any logical argument that this author might make. This is a way in which these patterns that I've mentioned on both the right and the left have yielded a kind of muddled cynicism that is often not particularly political. It's very lazy and bad. It's a bad approach to intellectual inquiry. I think we can be attentive to an author's assumptions, to his or her context, all that stuff, while also taking seriously how they use evidence and advance their claims. We can teach our students how to test that evidence against other sources and help them see that truth is complicated rather than non-existent. Second, we should recognize that both liberals and conservatives have a lot to lose as the current neoliberal, free market-obsessed authorities continue to reshape higher education in the image of the market, to defund public education, to slash course offerings that don't immediately seem to translate to an obvious cash value, to meet or pretend to meet the problems of struggling and underprepared students by finding ways to dumb down our programs and use metrics as a substitute for real, often quite expensive problem solving. Now, what does any of that actually have to do with empathy, you might reasonably wonder? Well, this brings me to my third suggestion, which is that we need to teach courses and read books that concern themselves with moral philosophy. And they don't have to be explicit works of moral philosophy, but concerned with those questions. We should not pitch this to students simply as a matter of cultural literacy. We need to convince them that they are our partners in the great philosophical project of our time, and that is trying to figure out a universalistic moral framework for a pluralist society. To me, this is the most interesting debate among intellectual historians today. That is, does secular Western modernity have a coherent moral order of its own, even if it very often falls short? Or is it simply running on the fumes of Christendom and destined to run out of philosophical fuel pretty soon? When I think of the great modern liberal thinkers who have made the case for secular universalism, for a morality that tries to harness the best features of the liberal commitment to individual autonomy while reining in its excesses. When I think of people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, James Baldwin, more recently Jonathan Schell, Marshall Berman, E.M. Forster, their writings often seem really just to boil down to calls for empathy. I think they all had a faith that what Adam Smith called our moral sentiments are the core of what it is to be human, and they do make a meaningful attempt at empathy possible. I think of that great, often quoted line in Howard's End, only connect, live in fragments no longer. In other words, build bridges between yourself and other humans. Strain to see the world from their point of view, even if you can never quite get there. Intellectually, I think there's an awful lot here that is pretty coherent, although I know there are some of you who disagree with me. I think a long tradition of liberal thinkers since the Enlightenment, with some ancient precursors, have made the case that you don't need religious presuppositions to build these bridges of empathy. Even the most cursory look at history shows that religion has as often been a great enemy to empathy and goodwill in practice as its friend. Yet, psychologically, socially, emotionally, a set of texts and ideas, however persuasive, cannot do what the dense cultures of religious communities do with their mythologies, their web of cradle-to-grave ritual and social practice that bind members together, give them a sense of continuity over time, and persuade them that their ideology is not just a theoretical moral order, but really a way of life. We are facing a growing epidemic of moral and metaphysical shallowness, where self-help books on mindfulness and anti-anxiety medication paper over a giant void. We are all increasingly like the wealthy widower Henry Wilcox in Howard's End. Here's Forster again. Outwardly, he was cheerful, reliable, and brave, but within all had reverted to chaos, ruled, so far as it was ruled at all, by an incomplete asceticism. And I think that's often the best case scenario. I know it's true for how I feel half the time. And I worry that liberal thinkers have really not taken seriously the arguments advanced by a long tradition of left-wing and conservative critics of their tradition. People like Herbert Marcuse, Jane Jacobs, Charles Taylor, Alistair McIntyre, Wendell Berry, very recently, of course, Patrick Deneen, who have all pointed out the internal contradictions within liberal ideology and warned against an optimistic faith that we're simply getting better, that liberalism just needs to be fixed rather than fundamentally reconceived. We need our students to care about this problem, to see that participating in this project is the point of a liberal arts education. Now, will they learn to be empathetic citizens in the process? Maybe, but more importantly, I hope they'll at least come to see what's at stake in this attempt at an impossible thing. Thank you.
Now I gotta put this down. Thank you so much. That was such a great and stimulating talk. There's much that I agree with and much that I don't agree with. But so I have a comment and then two questions that I want to ask you to think about with me. So my comment is more general. I'm a little concerned or starting to question the way in which we use our students and our experiences in class to make generalizations about cultural dispositions. And I'm as guilty of it as the next person. So I just sort of throw that out there. So my first question has to do with if you think empathy is enough. So I think I'm really, really fortunate. I teach human rights classes, but one of the core things we talk about in those classes is the role of empathy in the expansion of human rights. So we use Lynn Hunt's book and things. But I also teach them about the limits of empathy, some of which have to do with the ideas of a kind of cultural imperialism. But more than that, I use Paul Farmer's work on pragmatic solidarity to talk about the way in which empathy may not be enough. Right? That once you feel, you also have to do, and then in doing, maybe you learn that you didn't quite get it right the first time. So I'm curious if you think, is there like empathy plus, which would I think where I would be. The other piece, or the other question is I want to ask you if you would say more about the role of neoliberalism in this, right? We've said a lot about the problem with where we are in terms of our families and the morality, but for me, I don't know that I see that we used to have some great moral fabric or family life that we've lost, but I do see the neoliberal undercutting of public institutions, whether it's the university, whether it's our libraries, whatever it is. So I was wondering if you could speak to, you mentioned it very briefly, where you see neoliberalism fitting into the project of building empathy.
Yeah, there's a lot there that's really important. Thank you. I've been also pondering this question of how we're talking about our students and wrestling with how I can convey some of what I have observed to you while not being unfair to the incredible range of student experience that I see, and the fact that they are really they're very early on in their own intellectual journeys. And I haven't been in this business long enough to have students coming back to me who are really grown up and in the world, but I know that will happen and that a lot of change can happen because we've all gone through those trajectories ourselves. However, I really appreciated what Susan said about seeing our students as canaries in a coal mine. And I think also what appeals to me about analyzing the dynamics of the classroom and these conversations I'm having with these bright young people about dense, interesting texts full of ideas is that it's one of the only occasions in our society when you have this kind of intellectual petri dish, when you can really access in a sort of not straightforward, but relatively simple way, a young mind's encounter with an idea in a cultural context. And so I suppose that's why I think it's really rich for reflection, and why I tried to make clear to you that I'm not at all making a generalization that applies to all my students, but I do think that there's a way in which ideas held by the minority have a kind of disproportionate effect. Of course, empathy is not enough. I guess what troubles me particularly about the critiques of empathy that I hear on the left is the way it really paralyzes conversation. And it says, here, listen to me, but you can never understand me. And second, the way it simply doesn't connect with the reality of how humans respond. So people will often say, well, empathy is a problem, but sympathy is fine. Simply having kind of a compassionate reaction to people in a difficult situation, that should be enough. It's fine to make that distinction in a dictionary, I suppose. But in practice, it really seems to me that sympathy, compassion, what Paul Bloom calls rational compassion, all these things, actually psychologically, at least they have some component that is premised on fellow human feeling. And so it's productive to talk explicitly about that, recognize its imperfection, and see this long tradition of thinkers who've wrestled with how to make the most of our limited human capacity for fellow feeling. I mean, as to neoliberalism, I suppose I can only echo what has been said. I mean, I was struck by the point that was made last night, I think during the Q&A, that when more and more students are paying these exorbitant costs, even to attend a supposedly affordable public institution like my own, we can't help but expect them to be racked by anxiety for how they will pay all of this off, and have less and less patience for these what seem to be kind of indulgent intellectual meanderings, even if for us they are so central. I worry very much. A lot of my writing on higher ed has been preoccupied with what I see as this slow divide in our country into a tiny elite tier of institutions for the very wealthy, and a vast landscape of denuded, increasingly high schoolized schools for everybody else. And it's very hard to have these kinds of serious conversations when our students are getting to us so unprepared, and we have to help them learn how to write a paragraph, right? How can we then do that and have any time left for philosophy? It's the core problem, right? Yes?
I might just be reiterating Karen's question. What about the idea that these are just secularized concepts and a lot weaker than their pre-Enlightenment forebears? Christian charity, caritas, would seem to be the root of empathy. Empathy might just be a secularization and a weakening of that original concept. So why should we not expect it, therefore, to act like something that is attenuated and weak? Just to give an example, Martin Luther King, made very clear that he loved everyone, and he was very happy that Christ said, love your enemies, but he didn't say you have to like your enemies.
I think from the perspective of a historian, you of course have to recognize the many continuities and complex relationships between Orthodox Christian ideas and secular Enlightenment liberalism, recognizing also the way in which figures of the radical Enlightenment were very self-consciously trying to build an alternative base because of the bloody, centuries of the wars of religion, in the sense that religion had been an absolute failure in practice to render that caritas in lived human experience. But of course, Christianity is not, it's not an intellectual system or a set of practices that sprang fully formed from, again, the perspective of an empirically minded historian, in the first century AD. It also has an intellectual history. It also has a story of complex relationship to cultural context. So, I think that there's sort of two distinct questions here. One is, can you come up with a sort of intellectual argument for the golden rule that is coherent without a form of theism? And then the second question is the lived experience question. And I think the real problem with secularization and its relationship to moral erosion has less to do with the erosion of the hold of particular theological commitments in an intellectual sense on more and more Westerners. It has to do more with the erosion of institutions. And that institutional erosion has been not just true of religious institutions, it's institutions, period. All of these devices by which, various moral codes became ways of life for us. And I've detected this as a pretty prominent theme in, I think, every talk that you've heard at this summit. And I think that's only driven home for me how these ideas have to be really incarnated, to use Christian language, for them to be meaningful, recognizing, of course, that secular liberals will only, err and put their heads in the sand if they turn away from the continuities and the intellectual debts that they have to religion.
Well, I guess I have a rather skeptical question. You've outlined some of the ways in which a postmodern critique of a kind of middle-of-the-road Enlightenment civilizational ideal can go to an extreme. And you've also pointed to various criticisms of how the right, in constructing an idea of fake news or constructing an idea of sort of presuppositions which are anti-religious, can also reject this kind of mainstream. But it seems to me that we can look at any number of policies, including a war that just got started last night, and we can see that there are numerous mainstream narrative elements that are used to justify these things. And it seems to me that there is actually a need for criticism of the mainstream, a very powerful criticism, which I see coming from the left and I see coming from the right, but I don't see that the mainstream itself, that the center, has this ability to critique itself very effectively. It seems to me that, in fact, it tends to buy in very easily, and often using the language of empathy and the language of kind of emotion and human rights and so forth, to justify acts of violence. So what kind of critique would you say that the center should provide of itself? What is the sort of, sort of empathetic but also Enlightenment rationalist self-criticism that can be made to prevent some of what I think both the right and the left correctly identify as excesses, abuses, and violent acts on the part of the mainstream, and in fact what would be called the establishment, right? The people who actually do have the power, they do have the money, they do have the missiles, and they use them. So what do you say to them?
That's an important question, and I meant what I said when I said that in the core of these two intellectual habits I outlined, there's a very, very profound truth. Foucault was really on to a lot of his insights in the way power is instantiated in these subtle ways, and I think that there's a lot of kind of common sense truth to the emphasis on presuppositions that you encounter in this particular stream of Protestant theology that I outlined for you. My criticism is aimed primarily at the sort of exaggerated and grossly oversimplified ways in which these two intellectual habits have come to function in academic and political discourse. And that's what I see as needing some reining in. I don't see that those modes of critique ought to be abolished, because you're absolutely right. I mean, I think William James in The Will to Believe lays out before the members of the Harvard Philosophical Society this very strident call to self-critique. I mean, his message in that address is essentially, you guys think you're a bunch of empirically minded, rational, perfectly objective scientists, you're moderns, you would never go in for religious extremism, you conduct your experiments in this wholly, perfect way with no influence of emotion, and you are fooling yourselves because you have your own assumptions about hypotheses that you could really entertain and those that are totally unacceptable without even a test. You have your own set of prejudices. You have your own sense of an audience you want to impress. And his point is that even you, those of you who are at the highest levels of intellectual attainment, you fall short of the level of self-criticism and self-awareness that is necessary to get a little bit closer to that asymptote of truth. So I think William James's call still very much rings true and relevant today, and it's absolutely valuable for more marginal philosophical perspectives if we want to retain this language of mainstream and margin, which increasingly is becoming dubious in our current moment. It's valuable and important in a democracy for those voices to be lobbing their intellectual grenades now and then. However, I think that they've developed some problems of their own, and that's simply what I've been trying to highlight.
Hi. So I'm going to start off kind of like Professor Zibby did last night with a confession. When you said Foucault's name, I audibly went, yes. And then I immediately felt called out the whole time you were talking about the way that the liberals think, because I've noticed recently that I do think in that way, and it's something I've been struggling with how to break out of, how to think in a different way. So for those that are student and would like to be their own teacher at the same time, I'm wondering how the three kind of solutions or steps to mitigate this issue work when you're the teacher and the student, if you're kind of going in this on your own to do.
Well, I think any kind of disciplinary approach to a subject, or any time you really fall in love with a particular thinker, that always comes with certain costs, and it's hard to become aware of it. But I think once we do, I think the thing that teachers need to do is the same thing that students or anyone who's sort of reading books and learning on their own should do, which is to have a sense of how to get another perspective. So, when I think about how I design an ideal undergraduate, history curriculum, I wouldn't want students taking only history, old school diplomatic and military history, by no means. I would want some courses like that and some courses really focused on post-colonial studies, race, gender, class, these things. I think the intersection of those perspectives and the way in which a presidential biography talks to more grassroots cultural approaches to history is the really fruitful thing, and is the way that we're all students, right? That all of us can start to kind of triangulate and discern our own sense of what happened and the limitations on actors on both sides of these difficult questions, right? And avoid the temptation of falling into a kind of black and white moral condemnation of one side or the other without weakening our own moral convictions. I mean, the last thing I want to do is encourage what I already see as a kind of tendency in my classes where students feel very reluctant to impose moral judgment, to say, I just think that's wrong, because they've gotten the message that you don't talk that way. And I think there is a way to speak that way in a civil fashion that is aware of one's own assumptions. And we can retain that while still trying to get into the minds of people who might be totally abhorrent to us. So when I think about reading lists, that's how I would go about it, or how I try to go about it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.